The city lights of Chicago spilled across the darkened streets below the towering glass of the Harper Tower, reflections flickering like distant stars in the polished surfaces. Inside the boardroom, Julian Harper stood at the head of the long mahogany table, his presence cutting through the murmur of executives like a blade through silk. Every eye in the room followed him with a mixture of fear and reverence, aware that his decisions could elevate or destroy their careers with a single word. His posture was impeccable, shoulders squared, hands resting lightly on the table, yet there was a subtle weight behind his gaze, a quiet loneliness that none dared acknowledge. Outside, the wind carried the distant hum of the city, a reminder of life moving relentlessly beyond the walls of controlled power. Across town, in the emergency room of Lakeside Medical Center, Claire Donovan moved with precise urgency, her white coat brushing against the sterile floors as she assessed a patient teetering between panic and relief. The fluorescent lights overhead reflected in her determined eyes, casting fleeting shadows across her face. She was unaware that somewhere above, in the mirrored reflection of the skyscraper's windows, Julian's sharp eyes traced her every movement. His lips pressed into a thin line as he watched her navigate life in crisis with calm efficiency, a rare stir of curiosity breaking through his usual composure. His mind lingered on the brief encounter they had shared at a charity gala months ago. A fleeting exchange of smiles and cautious words, and now recognition gnawed at him, entwined with something he had not anticipated, fascination. The contrast was striking. His world of polished power, rigid schedules, and calculated influence against her quiet heroism, unscripted and raw. He did not move at first, merely observing, the faint reflection of his silver-gray eyes mirrored in the glass as if searching for understanding in the distance between them. Claire's hands moved deftly, stabilizing the patient, adjusting monitors, speaking softly to soothe panic, completely absorbed in the life under her care. Julian's pulse quickened imperceptibly, a silent reaction to witnessing courage without the adornments of power. For a moment the world outside seemed to halt, the city's hum dulled to a distant echo. The faint scent of rain and concrete reached the skyscraper, mingling with the sterile antiseptic air of the hospital, as if the universe was folding itself to connect them in this suspended instant. He remained rooted, coat fluttering slightly in the breeze from an open window above, mind replaying the nuances of her movements, the steady cadence of her voice, the subtle expressions that betrayed thoughtfulness beneath resolve. There was an unresolved tension, the kind that settles in the stomach, neither anxiety nor relief, but a magnetic pull urging observation, curiosity, and something unspoken yet profoundly compelling. Julian's lips curved into the smallest of acknowledgments, a silent question cast into the empty air between worlds, his eyes never leaving her form as the city continued below, unaware of the quiet drama unfolding through reflection and distance. It was a moment suspended, cinematic in its stillness, heavy with the unspoken promise of collision between two lives whose paths were destined to converge, leaving viewers with an electric curiosity and a heartbeat of anticipation for the next chapter. Rain spattered against the hospital windows, the city streets glistening beneath the muted glow of street lamps as twilight descended over Chicago. Inside Lakeside Medical Center, the sterile hum of monitors filled the room, punctuated by the soft rustle of white sheets and the faint beeping that marked each measured breath. Julian Harper stepped through the sliding doors, his coat still damp from the rain, eyes scanning the room with a precision that belied the rare stirrings of personal concern tugging at him. A nurse approached cautiously, voice low and hurried. "She has been in an accident, barely conscious." Julian's gaze tightened, the composed mask he wore for the public slipping for a heartbeat. The name that had lingered in his memory, Claire Donovan, reclaimed vivid presence, her face recalling that fleeting encounter months ago at the charity gala, a brief exchange that now burned with unexpected intensity. He paused, hand brushing against the door frame, as the soft overhead lights reflected off the polished floors, the sterile scent mingling with the faint smell of rain seeping through the slightly ajar windows. Memories of her smile, the measured calm in her voice, the effortless grace with which she had moved through chaos, surged within him, leaving his normally controlled heart unsettled. Without speaking, he moved toward her bed, each step deliberate yet weighed with the subtle tension of someone unaccustomed to exposing private concern. Claire's eyelids fluttered weakly, and the monitors whispered her fragile state, each beep echoing like a metronome counting down to something irreversible. Julian stopped at the foot of the bed, observing her still form, noting the delicate curve of her hands, the faint tremor in her breathing, the resilience etched in the lines of her face even in unconsciousness. A single thought anchored him. He could not simply remain a distant observer this time. The rain outside intensified, streaking the windows, and Julian's reflection merged with the dim room, a silent witness to the collision of past recognition and present responsibility. The nurse stepped back, uncertain whether to intervene or leave him alone in the charged space, and Julian's eyes, sharp and calculating, softened for the briefest instant as he took in every detail of her vulnerability. The storm outside mirrored the turbulence within, an electric tension that neither spoke nor moved but lingered in the stillness, pulling him closer to a truth he had not anticipated. His coat clung slightly to his shoulders, damp and heavy, yet he remained rooted, the air thick with unvoiced words and suspended emotion. In that quiet, the faint memory of their past encounter, the hesitant smile, the brief shared laugh hovered in his mind, drawing him nearer without a sound. Every shadow, every muted reflection in the room seemed to conspire in holding him there, forcing a confrontation between his usual detachment and the unexpected pull of concern and curiosity. The world beyond the hospital walls continued oblivious, the city moving on in rhythm with the rain, yet within this small sterile chamber, Julian Harper stood at the threshold of recognition and responsibility, poised to bridge distance and step into a space where control was no longer absolute. His gaze lingered on Claire, and though she remained unconscious, the tension between past and present, observation and action, hope and uncertainty, wrapped the room in an unbroken thread of suspended anticipation, leaving the question of what he would do next unresolved, a cinematic pause that held the air taut and the heart waiting. The rain had eased to a fine drizzle by the time Julian remained at the hospital, standing just beyond the sterile perimeter of Claire Donovan's room. The fluorescent lights cast a muted glow on the linoleum floors, reflecting off his polished shoes, every step measured, deliberate. Claire stirred weakly, opening her eyes to find him at the foot of her bed, and a flicker of startled awareness crossed her face. I will stay if you will let me," she murmured, voice trembling slightly, uncertain yet drawn by the intensity in his gaze. Julian's silver-gray eyes remained fixed on her, unreadable yet unwavering, the faint crease between his brows betraying the rare vulnerability he allowed himself in private. Outside the room, a nurse hovered near the door, voice hesitant. "Mr. Harper, I am not sure if this is appropriate." The words barely registered to him. The soft hum of machines and the distant echo of the hospital corridor enclosed them in a bubble of tense intimacy. Julian shifted his stance slightly, hands at his sides, the edge of his coat brushing against the doorframe, a subtle reminder of the barrier between their worlds, yet the space between them had shrunk, compelled by circumstance. Claire's fingers clutched the edge of the blanket as if anchoring herself, her pulse quickening under the weight of his silent scrutiny. The storm outside had left the streets slick and shimmering, yet inside, a different tempest unfolded, one of curiosity, apprehension, and unspoken recognition. His presence was commanding without motion, protective without interference, a paradox that drew Claire's attention as much as it unsettled her. Julian's gaze scanned her face, noting the faint flush of recovery, the way her hair fell across her forehead, the delicate tension in her shoulders, and a quiet acknowledgment stirred within him. He could not simply leave, not now, not when proximity forced awareness of her fragility and strength intertwined. The nurse lingered, torn between protocol and the undeniable gravity of his attention, as Claire's whispered words echoed. "I am not sure what I feel, but I know you are here." Julian's lips pressed together, the smallest shift of his jaw betraying internal calculation, a silent agreement to remain despite protest, bound by circumstance and the force of his own restrained instinct. Each passing moment thickened the air, the hum of monitors syncing with the unspoken heartbeat of tension, the room charged with proximity neither could yet navigate with words. Outside the glass, reflections of passing ambulances flickered across the polished floors, mingling with the faint light from the rain-streaked windows. Visual motifs of movement and urgency contrasted against the stillness of their fragile intimacy. Julian's coat swayed slightly with each subtle adjustment of his weight, the only motion in the suspended space, a reminder that though the world pressed against the room, he would remain at her side. Claire's breath hitched softly, uncertainty mingling with relief as she took in his silent promise of vigilance, the closeness forced by circumstance pressing upon both of them. For a heartbeat, the hospital corridor seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of them in this fragile intersection of vulnerability and presence, and Julian Harper, the man who commanded entire corporations, now stood bound by proximity and a quiet, dangerous attention that he could neither ignore nor explain. The air remained taut with anticipation, each small movement, each measured breath a step into a new tension, leaving the question of what would unfold between them unresolved, the cinematic pause lingering, and the viewer's curiosity hung delicately in the space between their quiet acknowledgment and the storm of possibility yet to come. The hospital room was quiet save for the gentle hum of machines and the occasional shuffle of nurses in the distance. Julian Harper lingered near Claire Donovan's bed, his coat draped over one arm, the soft lamplight casting angular shadows across his face, highlighting the rare softness in his silver-gray eyes. He spoke in a low, deliberate tone, each word measured and weighted. "Your comfort comes first. No one disturbs this room." The words were simple, yet carried the authority and unspoken promise that he would shield her from any intrusion. Claire turned slightly, eyes still heavy from the morning medication, and felt a warmth she could not name, an invisible protection that radiated from his very presence. The room itself seemed to fold around them, the usual sterile atmosphere softened by his attentiveness. He adjusted the blanket across her shoulders, ensuring it did not slip, placed a small stack of her favorite books within reach, and tilted the lamp to cast a comforting glow rather than the harsh hospital glare. Every movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet conveyed a meticulous care that drew her attention, her fingers brushing lightly against the blanket he had smoothed with such deliberate gentleness. Julian did not hover, did not crowd, yet his presence was magnetic, a quiet intensity that demanded awareness without words. The city outside had begun its evening rhythm, distant car horns and the soft whistle of wine through the streets audible through the partially open window. Raindrops, remnants from the morning storm, clung to the glass, reflecting fragmented light onto the floor. Julian's gaze followed her slight movements, noting the faint tremor in her fingers as she reached for a book, the subtle rise and fall of her chest, the way she blinked slowly, still recovering yet resilient. In that measured silence, Claire felt the gravity of being seen, not as a patient, not as a statistic, but as someone worthy of care, of attention, of protection. She turned slightly toward him, eyes meeting his in fleeting acknowledgment, a spark of unspoken understanding passing between them. Julian shifted minutely, a careful, controlled motion, his hand brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead with a gentle precision that contrasted the rigid strength he carried elsewhere. He stood there, coat still in hand, embodying a paradox, formidable in every other domain, yet here near her, entirely dedicated to her well-being without expectation or intrusion. The quiet intimacy, layered with unspoken history and restrained emotion, created a tension in the room that was both palpable and tender, a suspended moment between observation and connection, protection and vulnerability. Claire's breath caught subtly, the weight of his attention mingling with her own awareness of how the day had changed, how her world had been quietly invaded by a presence she had not anticipated yet found herself relying upon. Outside, the city moved on obliviously, but within these walls, a fragile bond was forming through gestures, silences, and the unbroken thread of care Julian wove around her. Each tick of the monitor and distant shuffle of staff only heightened the suspended anticipation, a cinematic tension that promised, without words, that their proximity was more than mere circumstance. The moment stretched, unresolved yet rich with emotional weight, leaving both Julian and Claire poised at the threshold of connection, the room heavy with the promise of intimacy and the quiet pull of something neither dared yet name. The evening had deepened into a soft twilight, and the city beyond the hospital windows shimmered with reflections of neon signs on rain-slicked streets. Julian Harper remained near Claire Donovan's bed, his presence steady and commanding, yet tempered with a restraint that made the air between them electric with unspoken significance. He spoke quietly, voice low and deliberate. "I have never seen anyone face fear like that alone." His words hung in the space, carrying more weight than the simple acknowledgement, echoing the recognition of her courage and resilience. Claire turned her head slightly, the faint flush of warmth on her cheeks betraying the shift in her awareness, as she registered the unusual softness in his gaze. Outside the room, a nurse paused in the hallway, Noting the subtle change in the atmosphere, her steps hesitant as she glanced at Julian, now less a figure of distant authority and more one of attentive care. The staff who had previously whispered about his intrusion now found themselves observing quietly, a new admiration threading through their glance, sensing the protective aura he exuded. Julian adjusted the blanket across Claire's shoulders with careful precision, ensuring comfort while maintaining distance, the simple action magnified by the quiet intensity in his eyes. She reached for her water glass, and he handed it without a word, fingers brushing hers briefly, the contact lingering with silent acknowledgment. Each movement, each glance was imbued with attention that neither spoke of directly, yet conveyed a growing emotional trust between them. The soft hum of the monitors, the faint tick of the wall clock, and the distant murmur of the city created a cinematic backdrop, each sound framing their subtle shifting bond. Claire noticed the care in his attentiveness, the slight tilt of his head as he observed her, the measured breathing as if sinking to hers, the way his coat remained at hand, ready yet unobtrusive. The room seemed to contract around them, isolating them from the rest of the world, leaving only the quiet dialogue of glances and small gestures to communicate the depth of feeling neither dared voice aloud. Julian's eyes traced her face, noting the resilience in her eyelids, the soft tension in her jaw, and the delicate strength in her hands, all of which seemed to draw an almost magnetic admiration from him. Claire's own chest tightened, a mixture of anticipation and awareness settling like a tangible weight, as if the air itself were charged with their mutual recognition and the quiet escalation of trust. The gentle light from the bedside lamp caught the edge of his coat, the curve of his shoulder, the subtle movement of his hand as it lingered near hers without intruding, signaling devotion without possession. Each blink, each shift of weight, each quiet acknowledgement reinforced the silent promise forming between them, a delicate balance of admiration and restraint that neither could yet articulate. Beyond the hospital walls the city continued, unaware, the rhythm of life uninterrupted. Yet within this space, Julian and Claire existed in a suspended moment, a cinematic tableau of protective attention and quietly shifting emotions. The scene ended with a fragile tension lingering between them, the quiet pull of connection unresolved, leaving both Julian and Claire poised on the precipice of deeper emotional engagement, the anticipation thick and unbroken, a cinematic breath held before the next turn in their intertwined journey. The night had settled over Chicago, the streets glistening from earlier rain, reflecting the scattered glow of streetlights like fragments of fire on wet pavement. Inside the hospital room, the soft hum of machines filled the space with a steady rhythm, a quiet counterpoint to the tension pressing between Julian Harper and Claire Donovan. Julian leaned against the wall near her bed, arms crossed loosely, his silver-gray eyes shadowed with thought, every line of his posture controlled yet betraying the rare flicker of internal conflict. Claire shifted slightly under the sheets, a faint tremor in her hands, voice barely above a whisper. "I am not as strong as I seem, sometimes I am afraid." The confession hovered in the air, fragile and sincere, drawing Julian's gaze fully to her for the first time in a way that held something beyond observation. Empathy, vulnerability, recognition. The nurse paused outside the door, her footsteps soft on the linoleum, sensing the weight in the room, uncertain whether to interrupt or leave them in this charged silence. Julian's jaw tightened imperceptibly, lips pressing together as he absorbed the words, the rare crack in his otherwise impenetrable demeanor. He did not speak at once, instead he stepped closer, each motion deliberate, the coat he had left draped over a nearby chair now forgotten. His eyes softened, the usual command in his expression replaced by careful attention, as though weighing each word, each breath, to ensure his response would not overwhelm the fragile trust she had extended. Claire met his gaze, a quiet tension vibrating between them, a mixture of fear, relief, and unspoken questions. Her chest rose and fell steadily, the monitors providing a metronomic backdrop to the emotional rhythm in the room. Julian's hand hovered near the edge of her blanket, a subtle movement laden with protective intent, a silent reassurance that he was present, that he understood the weight she carried. The distant murmur of the city outside and the occasional shuffle of nurses in the hallway framed the intimacy of the moment, making the room a cinematic island removed from the world, where vulnerability could be shared without judgment. He finally spoke, voice low, measured. "You do not need to carry it alone." The words were simple yet resonant, conveying a depth of understanding that transcended formal reassurance, the embodiment of protective intent without intrusion. Claire's eyes glimmered with a mixture of gratitude and lingering doubt, a fragile acknowledgment of the shift in the dynamic between them. Julian remained near, vigilant but restrained, every slight movement deliberate, every glance carefully calculated to convey support without pressure. The silence between them was heavy with meaning, filled with unspoken possibilities and the raw, delicate pull of trust and emotional exposure. Outside the room, life moved on, oblivious to the intimate and precarious balance within. Yet within these walls, two lives were quietly entwined through vulnerability, restrained attention, and the slow, deliberate weaving of emotional connection. The moment lingered unresolved, a cinematic pause rich with anticipation, the air taut with potential, leaving both Julian and Claire poised on the edge of what could come next, hearts and minds suspended in careful hesitation. Snow had begun to fall outside the hospital windows, drifting in gentle silvery flakes that clung briefly to the glass before melting into the city's glow. Julian Harper stood beside Claire Donovan, the faint warmth of the room contrasting with the crisp chill beyond, his coat draped over a chair nearby, sleeves rolled back slightly as if even his uniformity had loosened in her presence. He spoke, voice low and deliberate, carrying a weight that filled the quiet space. "You are safe here." The words landed softly, yet with undeniable authority, bridging the gap between fear and comfort, acknowledgment and protection. Claire's eyes widened slightly, the faintest tremor passing through her, a mixture of relief and surprise, as the simple assurance resonated deeper than any elaborate gesture could. The hum of machines and the distant murmur of the hospital became a muted backdrop to the gravity of the moment, the space between them taut with an unspoken understanding that had been slowly building for hours. Julian reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face with a precision that was gentle yet intentional, and the room seemed to hold its breath. She leaned slightly into the gesture, not from need, but from a silent recognition that his presence had become a shield, a constant pulse of reassurance against the surrounding world. Outside, the city lights refracted through the falling snow, painting the room with scattered specks of silvery illumination, each one accentuating the subtle shifts of emotion in their glances and movements. Julian's eyes, usually so guarded, lingered on her with a rare softness, the intensity in them deepening the bond of attention he had been cultivating, a dangerous tenderness that pulled her awareness to every micro-expression, every tilt of the head, every inhale. Claire's breath caught, a slow exhale escaping as she recognized the protective obsession in his silence, the way he measured his presence around her, making each movement deliberate yet unobtrusive. He adjusted the blanket over her shoulders, ensuring the comfort was exact without the need for her to ask, his fingers lingering momentarily at the fabric, a tactile assertion of care. The room held the quiet cadence of intimacy without words, punctuated only by the soft ticking of the clock and the whispered fall of snow outside. Julian shifted slightly closer, the proximity carrying a magnetic weight, his shoulder nearly brushing hers as he remained attentive to her breathing, her small adjustments, the faint color rising in her cheeks. In that suspended space, Claire felt the culmination of hours of silent attention, small gestures and protective instincts, all coalescing into a moment that was simultaneously grounding and exhilarating. The faint reflection of streetlights in his eyes mirrored the snow outside, framing the scene like a cinematic painting. A man of immense power and control, surrendering only here in this quiet room, to a protective devotion that spoke volumes without a single intrusive word. She looked up, meeting his gaze with an unspoken acknowledgment, her own chest tightening with the subtle pull of longing and the fragile thrill of emotional safety. Yet the moment was not complete. Outside the room, life continued. The snow fell, the city moved, and yet within this quiet cocoon, Julian and Claire were suspended at the precipice of vulnerability and connection, hearts and minds held taut, the promise of deeper intimacy lingering like the falling snow, unresolved and quietly demanding the next move. Snow continued to drift against the tall windows of Lakeside Medical Center, each flake catching the muted city lights and scattering them across the floor in fractured patterns that danced softly across the sterile walls. Julian Harper remained at Claire Donovan's side, the faint warmth of the hospital room contrasting with the winter chill beyond, his posture relaxed yet alert, every muscle attuned to her presence. He spoke quietly, voice deliberate. "You are safe here." The words weighted with the gravity of unspoken promises, carrying both authority and tender reassurance. Claire's eyes widened slightly, the faint color rising in her cheeks, and she felt a strange, steadying warmth bloom in her chest, the acknowledgment of safety more profound than any spoken comfort she had ever received. The hum of the monitors, the soft creak of the floorboards outside, and the whisper of snow against the windows framed the moment like a cinematic painting, each sound emphasizing the delicate tension suspended between them. Julian shifted subtly, draping his coat over the back of the chair nearby before adjusting the blanket over her shoulders with meticulous care, the fabric brushing lightly against her skin, a physical extension of the emotional protection he offered. He leaned slightly, not to intrude, but to ensure her comfort, the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the antiseptic air, grounding her in his presence. Claire turned her gaze toward him, lingering on the faint lines softened around his eyes, the careful movements of a man accustomed to control yet yielding gently here, in the intimate bubble of the room. Outside, the city lights reflected off the snow-covered streets, a scattered glow that illuminated the small charged gestures, the tilt of his hand as it lingered near the blanket, the subtle shift of his weight closer to her without contact, the careful observation of her breathing and posture. She felt the pull of his attention, the almost magnetic draw of his presence, and yet the restraint he exercised heightened the intensity rather than diminishing it. Julian's eyes met hers, silver-gray depths softening, vulnerability glimpsed behind the usual command, and in that silent exchange, Claire sensed the full weight of his devotion, protective, precise, and dangerously tender. The snow intensified outside, each flake a quiet punctuation to the suspended intimacy inside, and she noticed the careful alignment of his movements, his breathing, the slight furrow of his brow, all communicating concern without overwhelming intrusion. Time seemed to stretch, the room holding a cinematic pause, where every glance, every micro-movement conveyed volumes. Julian's hand hovered momentarily near hers, a subtle temptation of touch that never crossed boundaries, allowing the tension to build, electric and intimate. Claire's heart quickened, a fluttering anticipation that mirrored the falling snow, each flake a silent witness to the emotional breakthrough forming between them. The quiet intimacy deepened, tethered by gestures, unspoken words, and the careful orchestration of presence and attention, leaving both poised on the precipice of further connection. Outside, the city continued oblivious, and the snow fell in unbroken rhythm, yet inside 2 lives were suspended in this charged equilibrium, a delicate balance of longing, protection, and quiet revelation. The air remained thick with unresolved possibility, cinematic and taut, a heartbeat of anticipation lingering before the next shift in their intertwined journey, leaving both Julian and Claire on the cusp of emotional confession and hesitation, suspended in the fragile space between safety and the pull of something deeper. The quiet in the hospital room had deepened, the city outside blanketed in a thin layer of fresh snow, the distant hum of traffic muffled under its weight. Julian Harper stood near the window, coat draped over one arm, hands tucked into pockets, eyes tracing the falling flakes as if searching for a reason to leave yet unable to move. He spoke, voice low and hesitant. I should not be here. And yet, his words trailed into the still air, unfinished, a fragile admission of the pull that bound him to Claire, the unspoken acknowledgment of emotions too complex to name. Claire shifted slightly in bed, the blanket curled tightly around her, sensing the tension in his stance, the silent push and pull of restraint and desire that lingered like static between them. The monitors hummed quietly, punctuating the moments with subtle reminders of life continuing even as time seemed suspended in the space they shared. Suddenly, the door opened softly, and a nurse stepped in to check vitals, the click of her shoes against the floor echoing in the room and drawing a brief, tense pause from both Julian and Claire. At the same time, a call came from hospital administration about a routine update, the electronic buzz cutting through the intimate silence, a reminder of the world pressing in and threatening the fragile cocoon they occupied. Julian's hand hovered near Claire's, just above the blanket, yet he did not touch, his restraint deliberate, the small distance between them charged with unspoken meaning. Claire's gaze met his, hesitant and searching, reading the pull of emotion he could not voice, the weight of his attention both protective and longing. The snowfall outside painted the room in silver shadows, light scattering across the walls, across his face, highlighting the subtle crease of concern between his brows, the soft tension in his jaw, the fleeting vulnerability that only she had glimpsed. Every breath, every slight movement, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, the tilt of her head to follow his eyes, spoke volumes of emotion neither dared articulate. Outside, the city moved under the quiet layer of snow, oblivious to the fragile standoff, while inside, the room held a taut cinematic pause, where every sound, every reflection, and every shift of weight amplified the intimacy and hesitation. Julian's eyes, shadowed yet intense, lingered on her face, seeking permission for an emotional step he had not dared take, and Claire, sensing the tension, leaned subtly into the unspoken, her hand twitching toward his but stopping short, caught between desire and restraint. The nurse's presence, though brief, and the distant phone call acted as invisible barriers, framing their hesitation with external interruptions that heightened the suspense. The air between them was thick with anticipation, a delicate balance of emotional revelation, protective distance, and the unsaid confession that hovered just beyond reach. Neither moved, yet the room seemed to pulse with possibility, cinematic and suspended, the delicate tension threading through their silent exchanges, leaving both Julian and Claire poised on the edge of emotional disclosure, hearts taut, breath shallow, the anticipation of connection lingering and unresolved as the snow continued to fall outside, promising yet another moment of suspended intimacy, awaiting the next shift in their fragile bond. The ceremonial hall was bathed in golden candlelight, flickering against the high vaulted ceilings and the intricate carvings along the walls, casting long dancing shadows over the assembled royal council. Snow glinted through the tall arched windows, settling silently on the palace grounds, adding a sacred stillness to the moment. Julian Harper knelt at the center of the hall before Claire Donovan, his silver-gray eyes steady, controlled, yet carrying a depth of emotion that seemed almost visible in the way his shoulders shifted with restrained intensity. Claire stepped forward, her breath steady, eyes reflecting both resolve and reverence. She spoke the ancient bond words with clarity, voice ringing through the hall. "By this sacred oath, I give myself to the one who protects my heart and honors my soul." The words, both soft and commanding, echoed, and a palpable shift moved through the hall. The council members' murmurs hushed, replaced by a reverent silence. Julian's hand rose slowly to touch hers, fingertips hovering before finally brushing her knuckles with deliberate tenderness, a restrained yet unmistakable gesture of acceptance. The sacred bond ceremony commenced, delicate and deliberate. Julian rose slightly, just enough to align their hands, while Claire stepped closer, both guided by the ritual yet aware of their own shared emotional choice. Candles reflected in their eyes, the flickering light dancing across their faces as they exchanged the symbolic clasp of hands, confirming the bond before all witnesses. The royal council, previously rigid and formal, watched the ritual unfold with quiet awe, sensing the depth of connection, the mutual acknowledgment of choice, strength, and devotion. Julian's lips parted just once, voice controlled yet resonant. "You are mine as I am yours. In sight of all, I will protect and honor you." His declaration was succinct, cinematic, a public recognition of their bond without excess, the weight of his power focused entirely on her. Claire met his gaze, chest rising with steady certainty, feeling the gravity of the words, and chose fully, responding with a soft affirmation. "And I am yours willingly, with my heart unguarded." Their foreheads met in a brief, intimate touch, a silent communion that conveyed trust, love, and the fulfillment of the unspoken promise that had been building since the first glance. Julian bent slightly, kneeling before the gathered council as a gesture of reverence and commitment, the ultimate display of his acceptance and protection, symbolic of the Alpha King acknowledging the Omega as center of his life and realm. The council members inclined their heads, ceremonial acknowledgment echoing through the hall, their expressions softened by the rare display of tenderness from the formidable Alpha. Outside, snow continued to fall, muffling the world beyond, yet inside, the room radiated warmth and completion, the culmination of tension, hesitation, and growing trust crystallized into a shared destiny. The golden light, the reflections in the polished floors, the gentle clasp of hands, and the quiet, unwavering gazes framed the moment as cinematic and monumental, the emotional resonance complete. Julian and Claire stepped back together, hands entwined, shoulders nearly touching, exhaling a shared breath that carried relief, reverence, and fulfilled longing. In that suspended light, the sacred bond ceremony concluded, and the audience, royal council and kingdom alike, bore witness not to a fleeting encounter, but to the fulfilled legendary union of Alpha King and Omega, a destiny acknowledged, chosen, and sanctified, leaving the hall imbued with quiet triumph, tender devotion, and cinematic, everlasting reverence.